Welcome back to the Convo Couch, everyone. I am Pasta Jardula.
And I'm Fiorella.
And Jonny Sue is fumbling things up over there, but he's on those ones and twos spinning, and we have a special guest in the studio today. He's been on the show before. You know him. He's running against Nancy Pelosi in San Francisco for Congress. With us today, friend of the fam, Shahid Buttar is here. How you doing, Shahid?
So good to be with you. Thanks.
Thanks for coming back, man. Your personality is really growing. You're getting out there. We saw you on Jimmy Dore last week. You've been making the rounds. You've been really hitting the ground hard, and your campaign seems to be in full stride. What's going on up there? You want to give us a little glimpse of what's going on?
Sure. There's a hive that's emerged around our campaign, a community that is energetic, diverse, inspired, increasingly ubiquitous around the city. The military escalation in Iran that our criminal president initiated, with Speaker Pelosi unfortunately paving his road to war before then trying to close the doors after the horses had escaped. That really prompted a lot of action here in San Francisco. So there have been several marches and rallies over the last week, and I've been fortunate to have the chance to speak at several of those. We've been continuing our field operations, so canvassing and dropping lit across the city, basically building the base that we're going to need to beat Pelosi in November. And really very excited about the presidential debate this evening. And, we're all in for Bernie, and I'm looking forward to doing everything I can, as we have been on the ground here in San Francisco, to deliver the most populous state for our next president.
Yeah. You described that, too, that trans-partisan consensus around the middle. We caught you in that video. You were talking about it with Jimmy Dore. You even highlight the commonalities between libertarians and progressives, which I do like, because I consider myself to be a progressive, but I consider myself to have a lot of libertarian views, like a lot of my fellow friends across America. And you said the divide is not necessarily between the right and the left, it's between the center and the peripheral. Can you give us a little insight to what that's all about? But more importantly, how do you expect a lot of libertarian-minded people to come vote for you, especially when the Democratic Party, and even in California, has been so resistant to letting outsiders come in?
Yes. Great questions. Let's start with the second in terms of the bringing in libertarians to support our cause. I think a lot of libertarians are outraged, particularly by the surveillance state that Speaker Pelosi is an architect of. And a lot of them aren't going to like my positions on the federal jobs guarantee and the Green New Deal. They're not necessarily going to like my support for universal health care and Medicare for all. Yeah. But frankly, I think because they're libertarians, they're aghast enough by paramilitary police, and they're aghast enough by mass surveillance, and they're aghast enough by executive secrecy and Speaker Pelosi's unfortunate and longstanding complicity in executive secrecy across contexts, across administrations. I think those folks are naturally, and have already seen in our campaign, an ally. And now I've gone and forgotten the first part of your question. It was 2 minutes. Just can you give me the first part again?
Well, I mean, I wanted I wanted to know pretty much how you're going to get people into that, libertarians that come vote for a Democrat, especially when the Democratic Party has just given any outsiders, the Heisman Trophy, the stiff arm. They're not letting people in. So I know the party itself. How do you overcome that? When you have to run as a Democrat, when you're not the everyday Democrat.
Well, so the key for us here in our race is the jungle primary. That's what enables the viability for this race. So in most states, the primary election, if you're within the same party as the incumbent, you have to beat them in the primary, like Ocasio-Cortez did with Crowley, in order to have a shot at the general. Here in California, that's not the structure. All the parties run against each other. So at least in March, I only need to take second place. And to that extent, as much as I appreciate the support of any voter, whatever their ideological inclination, San Francisco is a Democratic Party town. Like, there are libertarians here; they exist, but it's a Democratic Party town. So as much as that part of the strategy is an integral one for our victory in November, really the key for us both in March and November is just reaching out across the city, engaging the members of the community who might not be as involved in politics, folks who might not be paying as much attention. Our campaign has certainly grown very visible, both to people who are concerned about politics around the country, as well as San Franciscans who are savvy and engaged on digital media, folks who maybe get their news from cable TV and who aren't otherwise very engaged in politics. That's still a community and a slice of our city that we need to get the message out to. And so that's really where the knocking on the doors, where the dropping the lit, where the being active at marches, rallies, protests, lectures, concerts, that's how we're getting that word out and identifying voters across the district. And ultimately that's how any election gets won, right? It's by recruiting and identifying voters, by mobilizing and inspiring and connecting volunteers, and by recruiting the support of the donors across the country. At this point, we're about 100 people off of 9,000 donors across the country, and we've got hundreds of volunteers that are active at any given point. And I just feel really grateful for all that support. And to be honest with you, when you ask how we're going to break through the Democratic Party stiff arm, you're right that they're going to try to stiff arm us. But I mean, to be honest, from where I'm standing, given how fast we're moving and how much time we still have left, as far as I can tell, the establishment already lost, and they just don't know it yet.
Ooh.
Just to follow up on that, how important is class warfare? Because he talked about the periphery versus the center, but really we can even equate that to the establishment versus the working class. How important is it to focus, specifically in your campaign, on class warfare, class consciousness?
Class consciousness is very important. I want to distinguish that a little bit from class warfare, and I'll push back on the conflation of center periphery and top down, only insofar as, and follow me here, there are a lot of people here in San Francisco. It's somewhat unique in that we have a lot of poverty, obviously, but we also have a great deal of opulence alongside it. And it just so happens I happen to know a number of very well-resourced people, many of whom are supporting our campaign, who share our concerns. And when we talk about the 1% being the problem, they certainly have interests, and their interests are the problem. But in my mind, it's the institutionalization of their interests. This is what corporate rule means. This is what hedge funds and capital represents, separate from people. And at the same time that I think there is a battle between the 1%, or as Bernie would say, the 0.1%, and the 99.9% of the rest of us who have to work, for our bread. At the same time, I see a lot of those very well-resourced people share particularly concerns about climate change and militarism. And while they might have the resources, for instance, to exempt themselves from the, economic vagaries of the market to which the rest of us remain subject, that it's not like their capital gives them hands on the reins such that they can actually dismantle any of the industrial complexes. The pharmaceutical industrial complex has its hand in their pockets too. The military industrial complex is, running their kids off a climate cliff as well. And a lot of them recognize that even their economic privilege can't insulate them, particularly from the climate chaos. And so I see it, and I don't want to overplay the hand here. I'm not going to say that the 0.1% is our ally.
Right.
I just mean to say that beyond class, I see the battle as people versus institutions. And the institutions are varied, but so are the people. And the people include some folks among us who have some resources. And I'm grateful for their support as well. To your point, though, to engage it very squarely, when you hear people reticent to engage the progressive, radical, socialist future, I think it's important to remind them, what is ultimately at stake. And I think that's where this class consciousness emerges. So many people take for granted that we have to make life choices, where we live, how we spend our time, what time of day we get up in the morning, around how we put bread on our table. And it's foolish, frankly. Another way to look at that is just the barbarity of forcing people who are ill to then confront potentially living outside without shelter, being exposed to the elements, because that's, we don't care enough about each other that we actually do that to sick people. These commitments to put exchange and reward and profit before human rights, before decency, before our neighbors, I think that's a stale, failed, predatory commitment that we are shrugging off the yoke of. And I think that very much emerges from class consciousness. The only reason I'm pushing back on it is I think there are a lot of people who have won the economic game who want also to throw the table off and usher in a new future.
And on that note, homelessness. It's a huge crisis all over California, particularly in very gentrified San Francisco.
Yeah.
A lot of candidates come on here and tell us that they really want to help, that they have ways of helping. But exactly how do you plan to address that? Because it's such a huge problem. It's such a big thing to tackle. What are some steps that you as a congressperson would take to help alleviate the situation?
Thank you for that question. Homelessness is an incredible crisis around the country, particularly here in California and particularly here in San Francisco. And it's an intersectional problem, which is to say it's driven by a number of compounding factors. One of them is the dire shortage of affordable housing. And so increasing the affordable housing supply is critical. One of the reasons we're in this crisis now is because the prior generation of policymakers, including Nancy Pelosi, have basically shredded the federal investments that used to go to states to create incentives to property developers to include affordable units when they were building new buildings. And so instead of having affordable housing investments by the federal government to ensure the availability of that supply, Nancy Pelosi and her generation of policymakers abandoned renters to the market. And so what markets around the country have been encouraging is luxury single person condos, because that's the best way to squeeze a buck out of a parcel of space. And that's a perfect example of how the market doesn't serve our needs and how it unfortunately leads to decisions that don't reflect the public interest. So one of the steps we need to do is to revive federal spending on affordable housing. Another thing we can do here in San Francisco, also in New York City, there are local reforms that have expanded the right to counsel to ensure that people facing eviction have a right to civil representation. And that's a big deal. When the right to civil representation in the criminal justice context gives us access, for instance, to public defenders, what this reform does in San Francisco and New York, it ensures that even if someone's not facing a criminal prosecution, they still have a right to a government-paid lawyer if the action by their landlord might, put them on the street. That right to civil representation for people facing eviction, I want to take that to Congress. I want to provide grants program to ensure that all states can provide that kind of opportunity to their residents. So counsel to keep people in their homes, more money to build more affordable housing. The last piece here I want to throw on the table is Medicare for all. People underestimate how much homelessness is driven by medical crisis. The leading cause of homelessness and bankruptcy is medical debt. And the idea that, people presume, I think a lot of times, that when you see someone who is unhoused, that maybe they made some bad decision or maybe they're addicted to something. More often than not, those are simply our neighbors who got sick. And it pains me. In San Francisco, you really can't walk outside without passing some set of people in a tent on the street. And it's a reflection of our shared failure. And if policymakers put the money into affordable housing that we should, if policymakers ensure that Americans can get to a doctor and get medicine instead of being forced into the street, the way, if we ensured those human rights, we wouldn't have this problem. And that crisis is a reflection, I think, of the failure of the past. And one of the reasons why I'm so confident that San Francisco is eager, like so much of the rest of the country, to welcome a brighter future.
That's some great stuff there. I really do like that. That's wow, that's good. Man, I love talking to you sometimes. I really do. I have a great time. Let me talk about something else, because you're a big believer and a fighter for civil liberties, and that's big to me. Obviously, you heard about that. But what would be your plans to curtail the behavior of these big tech companies like Google, Facebook, YouTube, who are just getting away with, stomping on our civil liberties through a way of blacklisting us, shadow banning us? Not only that, they're putting forth their rhetoric and really controlling the conversation. What are you going to do about it?
Are you familiar with SESTA and FOSTA?
No.
Let's start there. It's good that we're having this conversation. So there was a recent attack on internet freedom, and it relates to the set of issues you're talking about. It's a little complicated, but follow me here. This is basically the government, Kamala Harris in particular, and centrists, liberals, bragging about reforms that they said were going to protect sex workers and victims of sex trafficking. That was what these laws were supposed to do. What they in fact did was make tech platforms liable for the content that their users post. Now, that might seem innocuous, like who cares if a tech company has to pay some more money because they're liable for what somebody else does, except think of the incentive. You talked about the intervention of tech companies to silence us, for instance, right? Yeah. And one reason they might silence us, one reason they've already started silencing some communities of people who were previously internet users, is because, at least in the context of sex trafficking, sex work, the platforms are forced to bear criminal and potential civil liability, or civil liability for user-generated speech, meaning that when users want to, in the case of many sex workers, vet their clients online, to keep themselves safe from being harmed, as many of them are at risk to be at harm if they're on the street, right? That means that the companies then could face a lawsuit by the government. So what do the companies do? Of course, the companies start censoring the users. Yeah. And so this internet censorship has been encouraged by government policy recently that shreds both the First Amendment and the rights of some workers, particularly workers in the sex industry. And I feel very strongly that for the internet and free speech is critical, and particularly for people who use it to stay safe. And this idea that we are going to that Kamala Harris is going to run around the country bragging about placing a bunch of vulnerable people at risk of physical violence because she wanted to score political points and because she doesn't understand how free speech works online. In my mind, that's disqualifying. And reversing Sesta Fosta and restoring free speech is the first part of that agenda. Second part, for me, is eroding executive secrecy. Democratic transparency is the key to guarding civil liberties, whether from violations by corporate tech giants or by government intelligence agencies, or, as Edward Snowden shared with us, the intersection between them, which is profound, pervasive, and I would say entirely corrupt. And also hidden by layers of executive secrecy, not just enforced by the White House, enforced by Nancy Pelosi. Nancy Pelosi has a set of House rules that deny every member of Congress, except for a handful of her handpicked deputies, staffed with security clearance. What that means is that, for instance, the CIA's potential role in right-wing resource coups in Venezuela, Bolivia, and Brazil in the last year alone, nobody knows exactly what the CIA was doing there. The background of the recent assassination of the Iranian general, all of the facts there are unknown. Nobody knows. And it's not just because the Trump administration is hiding them from Congress and the public. He's doing it with the support of the Democratic Speaker of the House. And I want to press this point and make this really clear, because this is kind of why I'm running for Congress. I am kept up at night by constitutional crisis. It's not an abstract thing to me. I understand too well what is going down, and I see too clearly what the future will look like if we don't get a handle on our institutions before they, the gaping maw of fascism and the looming cliff of climate chaos, swallow what remains of our civilization. I feel very strongly here that we need to practice independence in our institutions. It's the essential genius that explains the constitutional design. Congress is supposed to fight the executive branch, not facilitate it. And when you have a democratically controlled House protecting the executive secrets of a criminal Republican White House, even as showing up for a theatrical impeachment process, we have a problem. And especially this idea of allowing Congress to get access to the facts. In my mind, it's disqualifying that Speaker Pelosi is leaning on the scale to keep Congress in the dark. And note that not a single member in Congress can talk about it, right? They all labor under her thumb. So you'll never hear Ilhan Omar or AOC or Rashida or Ayanna talk about this because they can't. Right. And so I feel some privilege in being able even to invoke this line of critique. If there's any central frustration I've had on the campaign, it's that more people don't understand this, the role that Speaker Pelosi has played in unfortunately facilitating CIA torture, NSA surveillance, wars for profit, who knows what else. Genocide in Brazil. I mean, these are objects of dire crisis and controversy that we need to have transparency over. So the top of my civil liberties agenda, in addition to reversing Sesta and Fosta and restoring free speech online, is to fight executive secrecy, expand democratic transparency. The single biggest thing we can do for that is to remove Nancy Pelosi from the speakership so that Congress can have an independent voice issuing unbiased rules that give members of Congress access to executive secrets.
I'm glad you think it's the number one issue, too, as well. Our civil liberties are under attack, and you're out there to protect them.
Doing my best. We're all in this together.
You got it.
I'm just going to switch gears real quick to what's happening now. So you're a Bernie supporter, as am I, but you have also shown love to Elizabeth Warren. How do you feel about the events that took place between the two recently, considering you've expressed, sort of like we need to see her as an ally before? Do you feel like this behavior still constitutes her as an ally?
Yeah, I'm glad you're paying attention. I am very disappointed in the Warren campaign, and I have been at different points. I'll say at the outset, the reason I was initially disappointed with the Warren campaign is that they didn't hype her story more about how she got to the Senate, because that story reflects the political spine that her campaign so often failed to demonstrate. And in the last couple days, I feel that the campaign has tried to contrive a spine in a particularly untenable place by, trying to kick Bernie down the stairs for supposedly, dismissing the possibility of a female president. Bernie supported a woman in the White House. He wanted Warren to run in 2016. He only ran in 2016 because she declined.
Absolutely.
He's on tape from decades ago predicting and promoting a woman in the White House. So this canard, this smear, frankly, of sexism, I think is opportunistic. It doesn't fit the facts. And it's certainly disappointing. I will go back to, and when you describe me showing love for Liz, I'll reinforce the same principle. I think we as Bernie supporters are well served by being ambassadors for Bernie's campaign. And the key to that is, frankly, by us having a smile on our face when we're talking to our neighbors, even those who might not see eye to eye with us. For us, as we're doing street canvassing and knocking on doors, the first thing we impress upon volunteers is you don't have to get in debates. Like, it's somebody who doesn't see eye to eye with you. You can share information. You can see differently. You can have different opinions, and you can still be neighbors. That's cool. It's all right. Just go on to the next house. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, that's what politics are supposed to be about. You don't have to get down into these lockdown, drag out fights with everyone. And when we think about Bernie and Liz, I think they have correctly recognized that they, on the Hill, frankly, have long been allies. They've been friends for decades, and with good reason. They've backed each other up in fighting the corporate establishment. Now, when I look at Liz Warren's presidential campaign, the continuity of her foreign policy with the military-industrial fossil fuel extraction complex by force is disqualifying. When I look at her campaign, I really wish that they were bolder and going to the mat and championing for the full-throated socialist visionary policies that have defined Bernie's campaign. But, the Warren campaign hasn't. I would say particularly this, as we look at Bernie versus Liz, in Bernie, I see someone who for 50 years has stood with every major progressive social movement that has emerged in the United States. And I would, for me, I haven't been around as long, but for the last 20 years, I've been a part of every democratic and progressive social movement that has emerged. The Occupy movement, the movement for Black Lives, the immigrant rights movement, the peace and justice movement, the anti-globalization movement. I've been there for all that. And Bernie's been there even long before that. And Liz Warren wasn't. And I appreciate that a technocratic, skilled expert who reads the facts very closely can grow alarmed by what she reads and then dedicate herself to fighting for the particular set of consumer fairness principles that she dedicated her academic career to. But the idea that it takes a technocrat to, with the focus of a Harvard law professor, examine all the facts to then grow alarmed, to me is also disqualifying, because the untenability of our current moment is laid bare for me and an entire generation to see. It shouldn't take years of study for someone to understand that the American people have been fleeced. And it took Liz Warren years of study to come to that conclusion. For Bernie, for me, for millions of Americans, it has been obvious from the beginning. It is the lens and the prism through which we see politics. And it is the liberatory praxis that Bernie embodies, not just as a candidate for the White House and not just as a U.S. senator, but as a human being his entire life, that I think has inspired so many of us to support his voice, to rally behind the idea that the future is inheres in a movement that includes no one me, but all of us. I see him embody that principle in a way that no political figure in my life certainly ever has. I'll put it this: Liz Warren didn't inspire me to run for Congress, but Bernie Sanders did.
Right. I mean, bottom line, one is going to change the actual status quo structure of the party, basically, and the other one is still trying to work within the reins of the system and fix it. As someone that understands both as a canvasser and as media, though, as a canvasser, obviously you're not going to debate with people, you're not going to argue with them, you're going to be very positive, and that's why it was so frustrating this smear, because you are told to do the exact opposite. As a volunteer, as a staffer, you are told to be positive, not even mention any other candidates. So for someone that has been propped up almost to the equivalent as Bernie Sanders, to say that this is not the case, and someone that Bernie was supporting and trying to get to run in 2016, it's not only disappointing, it feels like a betrayal, and it feels like maybe she was influenced by the party. I don't think this was her initial intent. And I still give her that credit. But ultimately, I do not see her in the same level as Bernie Sanders in any way, shape, or form. And I think, we have a very big choice here before us, a chance to actually change things. So, yeah, 100% agree with you on that.
Maybe one just further point. The time before that you were describing, I caught some heat from Bernie or bust people, my allies, for saying that Liz can be a friend. And the particular reason for it was that a debate between the two of them that goes on for some number of months could win us something bigger than the White House. It could transform the electorate, because no Americans have heard any of their ideas. right? I mean, at the moment, either Bernie or Liz are sort of off to the left of the spectrum that most Americans have been socialized to understand the world around. It's one reason why liberals are so confused about the election and surprised by Bernie and still rallying around Buttigieg and Biden and this parade of centrist clowns, that are sent to derail Bernie's nomination. And it reflects, I think, a disconnect, frankly, from reality, driven by cable television, if we were to be very direct and discreet about it. It's Fox News for Republicans, it's MSNBC for the liberals, and they all get brainwashed, and people who pay a lot of attention find their way to independent voices, and here we are. And I think as we embrace that moment, a debate between two voices that are beyond the goalposts could do so much to crack the brainwashing of the center, to expand the minds and vision and set of possibilities that Americans understand when they think about politics. I think of that as the biggest victory on the table. And the point of that earlier, and I'd stand by this suggestion now, was that we as Bernie supporters should be focusing our fire on Buttigieg and Biden. It is the centrists who pose the risk, not other potential aspirants to a progressive label. It perceives Warren as a tactical risk because theoretically some of her supporters could be Bernie supporters. And I think this is increasingly not true in the wake of her. I would use different words. I will leave it to Bernie to decide what's a betrayal or not. And I'll stick with disappointment myself. But in the wake of Liz's disappointing willingness to fire within the community, I think that it will be hard for her to support or to attract that support from the Bernie voters who frankly had propped up her campaign. I think the reason she got some steam last fall was by a number of people who see in Bernie the future, but were unwilling perhaps to embrace it, who saw her as a safer potential consensus alternative. And because she's now demonstrating sharp elbows, it's diminishing the opportunity that she can have to be a consensus candidate. I think that was the only pitch she had. Yeah, and once she goes negative on Bernie, which she just did, it burns a bridge that I think she really needed. I think Bernie needs, but frankly less so, as her campaign is failing to maintain the momentum that it had at one point. I think at the end of all this, at the end of the election, they will remain friends. She will remain his ally in the Senate, and I think that we're going to need Senator Warren to advance President Sanders' agenda, which is another reason why I'll just say to all the supporters, play nice, because it's not like the world ends on November 4th. We have to work together in the future. And I think under a Sanders administration, I think Senator Warren and many of her supporters could be our allies, even if they're not yet.
Yeah, and I'm just going to push back real quick on that she could be an ally in the Senate, and I'm with you there. I could even see her as involved in the cabinet in the Treasury, but the trust that has been broken by the majority of Bernie supporters right now, and even people who believed in her, has been completely they have shut her out because of this. It's not just one time. She has backtracked on Medicare for All. Has now pushed a public option, her foreign policy. I wouldn't consider her on the spectrum of Bernie Sanders at all. I would consider her left of center, maybe. Bernie Sanders, I think, stands alone as being a far, far leftist on foreign policy to me, which is to me inseparable from our domestic policy. We cannot separate that. She would continue the status quo with the military industrial complex that would in turn take money away from our domestic into these wars, and of course nothing would change. So I would push back on that notion that she is necessarily to the equivalent. I don't think she is a Hillary Clinton.
I don't mean in any way to suggest she's an equivalent. I thought I made that clear, but
yeah, I know, but saying that she's an ally of sorts, I mean, I think she is on line with the Pete Buttigieg and Bidens. We're also going to talk about the money she took from her Senate campaign run that she switched on over. Even Pete Buttigieg called her out and said, you took that same high donor class money as well. Not to mention the fact that she is going around with Hillary Clinton. I think that Elizabeth Warren is a cancer to the Bernie Sanders campaign, and the more likely ally is the Tulsi Gabbard crew. Would you consider Tulsi Gabbard an ally to your campaign?
Just to distinguish crews versus candidates, and part of what this whole controversy is being driven by is criticism not of Bernie, but ultimately supporters of his, right? And a little, there was this whole thing about the comments supposedly at a dinner that I think Liz also, inflated and seems to have mischaracterized. But all I mean to say is I think all of us are allies. And that's the point I'm trying to get at. There's an election right now, so people think about this all through competitive terms. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, I guess Tulsi hasn't necessarily, she's I think her future in the House is, she's got her decisions to make. But all I mean to say is that certainly Liz, and I hope Tulsi and Bernie, like, we'll all be in Washington together. And the reason I'm disinclined to demonstrate sharp allies with and I will say allies here, and as much as I hear your point that Liz is not in the same place as Bernie, and I've said that before and I'll say it again, she's not Bernie Sanders by a mile. When Bernie's fighting Wall Street, Liz is going to be by his side. And that's critical because nobody in Washington shifts anything alone. Right?
Yes.
And I agree with you that she would, if she was the president, she would continue the military industrial complex. I think when Bernie is fighting it, when she's in the Senate, I think she might show up for that fight with Bernie's in the lead, and she doesn't have to demonstrate the political will and independence that you do as a president. That's why we want Bernie to be the president, because he has the strength of conviction demonstrated for decades. Yeah. I want us to be very careful before we write off potential allies only because they're opponents in an election. Does that make sense? And I see Liz Warren through the longer arc of her longer career. And yes, she was a Republican until she was in her 40s. And to me, no, I can't have a president like that. But I also see her. I've seen her work against the banks. I've seen her work with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. I saw her work under the Obama administration, pushing it from the left. I was part of the Occupy movement. She was one of our most stalwart allies, right behind another U.S. senator, the future president, Bernie Sanders. And so I remember that history, and I'm not willing to throw her under the bus just because she and Bernie are locked in a struggle at the moment, because there is a future and we have to work at it.
Yeah.
Okay. I didn't want to step on my partner's toes here because I'm so anxious to say this, but I'm thinking strategically, and I know what you're saying, Shah, and I'm not trying to pin anybody against each other. I'm not trying to be tribal here whatsoever, but strategically, when I talk about the Tulsi Gabbard campaign, because there seems to be a big separation between the crews. There's a lot of Bernie Warren people. There's a lot of Bernie Tulsi people. And my mentality is let's not attack anybody. But some of those people have come under such big attacks online. And what I'm trying to say is strategically, last time Bernie Sanders would have beat Donald Trump easily, I think, if he wasn't cheating.
That's right.
This time, we're going to need a definite big coalition. And when you talk about Tulsi Gabbard's campaign, civil liberties, foreign policy, it almost echoes a lot of the stuff you say. And I think it's the type of coalition we need to really get Bernie over the top and beat Donald Trump, as if when it comes to Elizabeth Warren, saying I'm not going to go on Fox News, she's not going to get any of those people you talk about, those libertarians, those independent-minded people, those civil liberties people who really want us to tackle that. But this is the ally right here, and sometimes I think it's shunned away.
I could see Tulsi having a role in I think Fiorella had mentioned, the possibility of Liz being like a Treasury Secretary, right? I could see Tulsi in a cabinet, right? And she does have this independence on foreign policy from the military-industrial complex. I do very much value and appreciate that. When I look at Tulsi Gabbard, I also see her support for right-wing administrations in other countries, particularly the Modi administration in India. And that's really hard for me to square. I put human rights first, and that's kind of the end of it. Mm-hmm. And there seems to be some equivocation within her camp. And she's willing to fight the U.S. military-industrial complex, and that's great. And she seems a little too willing, in my mind, to embrace the military-industrial complexes of other human rights abusing countries. And to me, that's not okay either. And so I absolutely, and this is why I don't talk about Tulsi much, because it's the same point I was making before. I hope that we can all serve alongside each other and advance shared objectives. So, and this is why I'm distinguishing between the candidates and supporters. I think the supporters are much more willing to bear fangs and start attacking each other. But I'm very conscious of the fact that these are people who, in Tulsi's campaign, in Tulsi's context, she is also fighting many of the same fights. She's fighting the CIA, she's fighting the Pentagon. I value that. I don't want to kick her in the knees, even if, frankly, there's a pretty big issue that I don't see eye to eye with her on. She's my ally. Allies are people who we don't always see eye to eye with. And we have to expect that. That's sort of what being an ally means. I've worked for so long as an organizer. I'm used to working with people who don't agree with me about everything. That's kind of what politics is about.
Yeah. I mean, that issue too, I'm glad you're talking about that, because me personally, I have always had this dream that I see Imran Khan, Narendra Modi, Shahid Buttar, and Tulsi Gabbard sitting in a room bringing these people together, because I believe her decisions are more geopolitical than they are just standing up for a right-wing government. I know we can have arguments about that and stuff, but I asked her if she would talk to the Prime Minister of Pakistan, and she said that totally. And that's why I think of the bond, because there's no other candidates like you two, in running for office, in my personal opinion, that have such knowledge of these issues, these foreign policy issues. So
Right.
that's why I wanted to kind of put that on the table. And I'm glad that you said you do have an issue with that. I think it's geopolitical, and I would hope that you would be part of the process of getting these people into the room, because it is a problem over there, and nobody wants to stand up for anything. But I want my leaders, and I want you, when you get to Congress, I want you sitting down and talking to Putin. I want you sitting down and talking to Assad. I want you talking to these people. I don't want you shutting them out. So I hope that there is always going to be dialogue, whether you agree or disagree within those governments.
Diplomacy versus, confrontation, so to speak, is what we need to look for in foreign
Yes.
policy, regardless of our beliefs and where we come from. So, yes.
And if I can just engage that, diplomacy is critical to counter militarism, and it's smart foreign policy versus idiotic foreign policy. I do, though, also want to just note the roles. Generally, diplomacy is a role of the State Department. The State Department recruited me to serve as a foreign service officer 20 years ago before I went to law school. And I want to let career civil service bureaucrats do their jobs. The role for members of Congress with respect to diplomacy are congressional delegations, and I'd be very eager to participate on a congressional delegation anywhere in the world, including to places that might not be entirely friendly to us. And I think that to your point, it's especially important to show up there and build those bridges and build those relationships and demonstrate the open ear that enables the diplomacy on the back end. And I'm eager to, within the constitutional role that I'm auditioning for, to support diplomacy thoughtfully.
Now, moving on, do you still support impeachment? And do you think that Democrats are just as guilty as Trump, or if not just as guilty when it comes to what happened in Ukraine, when it comes to the emoluments involving Biden, Nancy Pelosi, her son, Paul Pelosi, Joe Biden, and Hunter Biden, and John Kerry, and his son, as well as Adam Schiff?
Yes and yes. I support an impeachment process that holds any official accountable for the theft of public resources, period. And that unfortunately includes too many corporate Democrats. Nancy Pelosi's impeachment process didn't include the president's corruption. And just before we chase that rabbit, it also didn't include the president's human rights abuses or incitements to violence or lies to the press and Congress and the public. Putting all that aside, just to focus for a moment on the theft of public resources, because Nancy Pelosi refused to examine the president's theft of public resources, her impeachment process is destined to fail. And I hate to say I told you so. I wish so many times that I would be proven wrong more often. But I saw this coming a year ago. I wrote in writing a year ago the case for impeachment that would have won. And for 6 months after that, Speaker Pelosi sat on her hands. And then finally, when a whistleblower forced her to show up for her oath of office, what she ran was this limited, deferential, so-called impeachment process that took off the table all of the president's worst crimes against our republic. And in doing so, a bunch of things happened. First, among the things that Nancy Pelosi effectively did was issue a tacit invitation to any future president to steal whatever they want from the American people. I'm not okay with that. Another thing that Nancy Pelosi did is issue a tacit invitation to any future president to lie through their teeth about anything, from the size of their inauguration rallies to whether it's snowing in Washington, who on the phone they talked to, they said what to and said back. I mean, it's preposterous that he would get away with any of this, let alone the incitements to violence and the human rights abuses. And the reason he's getting away with it is because Nancy Pelosi decided to say most of it's okay, and it's not okay. If we brought a real impeachment process that pulled the thread on corruption, it would not only bring down the Trump administration, and this is why corporate Democrats aren't going there, it would bring down half of Washington. And that's why they're not bringing it. I think Pelosi and her team and others correctly understand that if they invoked the charge that the president is stealing from the public, knowing the president, his response would basically be to say and document all the ways in which, yes, so are the rest of you. Another way of putting that is that we, the people of the United States, are currently paying profound constitutional costs for the corporate corruption of the Democratic Party, because it has built a glass house from which it is unable to throw the stone necessary for accountability. And while, what the Bidens did with appointing, letting their son be appointed to the board of a foreign energy company might not be illegal, it should be, because it's flatly corrupt and it's obviously corrupt. And it's that kind of corruption that makes, I'm going to go back about maybe 15, 20 minutes in the conversation. Craig, you were mentioning how, there's this body of trans-partisan critics of corporate rule who understand that the system is rotten, and many of them are the ones who, for better or worse, put Trump in office because they're not ideological.
Yeah.
They're just concerned and alarmed, right? And this is a way to meet those people where they are at as well.
Well, this is the last question. We're going to get you out of here. We're running low on time, but we have to ask this. I was going to ask this as the last question, but we have a Super Chat contribution from Mitch Osborne. Thank you, Mitch Osborne. As the Super Chat contribution is always appreciated on the couch. That's my little thing, Shah.
Little jingle.
Don't worry about it. He said, can we get a question on Shahid's stance on the current treatment of Julian Assange? And it will close us out, and do it, buddy.
Right on. I'm concerned about whistleblowers anywhere being denied their rights. And on the one hand, Assange has a complicated history. It doesn't diminish the extent to which he's gotten facts to the public that before were secret. And if we are meaningfully committed to transparency, we can't shoot the messengers, period. And I see his experience through the same lens that I see Chelsea Manning's, through the same lens that I see Reality Winners, through the same lens that I see Edward Snowden's, through the same lens through which I see Daniel Ellsberg's. You know, one of the most recent endorsements that we got was from U.S. Senator Mike Gravel, who in an earlier constitutional crisis defended a whistleblower, Daniel Ellsberg, by reading into the congressional record the Pentagon Papers, the documents proving that the Pentagon and the military-industrial complex was lying about the origin of the Vietnam War, that it was based on a hoax. And the reason Daniel Ellsberg is a national hero and not in international exile is because there was a Mike Gravel to support him in the Senate. And the reason that Edward Snowden is in exile instead of a hero is because there's no member of Congress who was willing to stand up for their oath of office when he fell on his sword and gave up his career to come forward with the facts to alarm the public that executive officials under the Obama administration, not even under Trump, were lying and had been lying for years. And none of those lies have been corrected. None of those problems have been fixed. Pelosi recently extended the Patriot Act for 3 years, extending the surveillance powers of a tyrant who she is supposedly resisting in Washington while supposing his trade policy and foreign policy and yada, yada, yada. Anyway, I'll get off my high horse, but I'm with respect to whistleblowers, Julian Assange and others, I'm very eager to defend transparency against executive secrecy, full stop.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you always swing it back to our most important issue, our civil liberties, and just can't we have this thing going. That's great. You know, Shahid, it's always great having you on. I mean, I wish you nothing but the best of luck. I wanted a couple years ago before I started the show. I can't stand Nancy Pelosi, but I said instead of going to Italy one year, I'm going to use all that money for Italy, and I'm just going to go up, and I'm going to, whoever Nancy Pelosi's opponent is, I'm going to go up to San Francisco and campaign for them to beat this woman because she needs to be removed.
Yep.
It's much more dire that she needs to be removed before Donald Trump, and that's just my personal opinion. I know people will say that's wrong, but I wish you nothing but the best of luck.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, you know, you have so much support, and I I do agree with you when you say, you know, we can't write off everybody. We are going to have our disagreements among progressives. We're not all going to see eye to eye on everything, but I think the most important thing is to fight the establishment that's there right now, get the money out of politics, get people like Nancy Pelosi out, get people like Donald Trump out as well, corrupt Democrats, corrupt Republicans, they're all on the same side. And we need to do our part to get them out. Yeah. So where can people find you? Where can they donate to you? I know a lot of people want to donate to you. Let them know.
Thank you so much. You can find us online at shahidforchange.us or on any of the major social media platforms, Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter at Shahid for Change.
Yeah. And, you know, when you get top 2 in this jungle primary in Frisco in March, I will be up there, and me and you, we're going to hit that dance floor because I know Shahid's got moves. You know I can dance. Shahid's got some moves on the dance floor. We're going to do to some old school hip-hop, my man, and we're going to party like it's 1999 because you're definitely getting top 2, my man.
Right on. I look forward to it. I'm looking forward to hitting another dance floor with you. Thank you so much for having me on today. Keep up the great work.
Thank you so much.
You got it. We'll see you in March. For Pasta Jardula.
And Fiorella Isabel.
Jonny Sue on the 1s and 2, and Shahid Buttar. Help him out. Give him $1. Give him $2. Give him what you can.
CONVO out. We'll be right back.
We'll be back with it.